The amount of money that has been thrown around on Rings of Power has just been beyond staggering to the point where it almost feels like Amazon wants you to think that our show has so much money behind it. It's just impossible for it to fail because no one's ever had a budget this big. Therefore, no one's ever been able to create a spectacle this big, and therefore, it's must watch television. By comparison, a lot of people have forgotten that the first season of Game of Thrones, the show that became the cultural phenomenon that still exists to this day, had a fraction of the budget at only $6 million per episode. And the reason that that show took off and did what it did, it became what it became, was because they weren't worried about the visuals or the VFX shots in those early seasons. They did in the later seasons, which we'll talk about later. But in the earliest seasons, the ones that got that show off the ground and turned it into this cultural phenomenon internationally was because they were focused on a few core components: good storytelling, good writing, and great acting without lots of VFX shots. It was just focused on just dialing in and nailing down those elements. Famously, the Game of Thrones pilot episode had to have 90% of it reshot at an additional expense of between $5 and $10 million because the executive producers in HBO was not happy with that finished result of that first pilot because they were so focused on getting that storytelling down that they were willing to spend the money to get it right and delay it until it was right, compared to Rings of Power, which, by the way, has a 50 plus, what is it, 50, look at the calculator, $56 million per episode budget for the Rings of Power. Oh yeah, they spent $700 million on the first season of Rings of Power, and that includes the rights purchase. And we're going to be diving into those numbers today and why big money doesn't necessarily mean anything. I'm Tim Anderson, aka Renfield, the bearded dwarven princess, and welcome back for another Rings of Power rant. Returning visitors, you know what you're in for. Those of you who might be new, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you get updates like this delivered to you every time I go live. Don't forget, every Monday at 11 a.m. Central Time, we do the Mondays in Middle Earth, a read through of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, so we can continue to poke fun at and sometimes give credit where credit is due to the Rings of Power, although those moments are few and far between. And to support this channel, because I know you love to, because you love this stuff and you want to keep me on the air, just join as a member of the Adventurers Guild down there. There's 3 tiers, and on these premieres, those of you who are here during the live stream premiere where I'm in chat hanging out with everybody, watching this with you, you can do super chats and stickers, and then after the fact, you can do a super thanks. All are great ways to contribute. You can pick your own amount, go from there. At the end, we'll talk about other ways, but in the meantime, let's talk about budgets and how big numbers don't mean shit in the scope of creating good prestige television. So, Rings of Power cost $700 million to produce the first season. That's not me making up numbers. This is the Hollywood Reporter reporting this in the most recent article interview they did with the showrunners of Rings of Power. Now, that is including the rights. So if you strip the rights out for $250 million, you're left with a $450 million budget for season 1 of Rings of Power. That breaks down to 56.25 million. So over 56,250,000 per episode. I had to laugh because in this same exact article by Hollywood Reporter, the showrunners literally say that no one's doing this for the paycheck. And I literally have to laugh when you make that claim. Because anyone who thinks that you're not doing it for the paycheck when there's a $56 million production cost per episode attached to this show is out of their fucking mind. Now, by comparison, there's a great article that I covered the other day which talks about how the Wheel of Time should have had a bigger budget. Season 1 of the Wheel of Time was made for a reported 80 million, which breaks down to around $10 million per episode. And for all intents and purposes, $10 million per episode is still fairly low. You look at House of the Dragon as an example, is coming in under 20 million, but it's still up there. And I believe most of the Star Wars shows are costing around, $20 million per episode to produce. That's a fairly standard number these days, 15 to 20 million for prestige television, for high quality productions. So to think that we've got shows like, as an example, The Mandalorian or I hate to say that Wheel of Time is good, but by comparison, spending $10 million an episode, I look at what Wheel of Time produced for $10 million an episode, and I look at what Rings of Power produced for 50. Hang on, I laugh every time I talk about that number. 56 million. That number is just it blows my mind. The difference between a $10 million per episode and $56 million, I don't see a lot of visual differences there. The VFX do look a little better in Rings of Power, but that don't impress me much. Now I go back to the first season of Game of Thrones, and I love it because the first season was produced for around $6 million per episode, and it did rise to around $15 million per episode by the final season because they started to include more and more VFX shots and battle sequences that had dragons and other things in them. And I would argue, and I would say that I'm probably not incorrect in this argument, that the later seasons of Game of Thrones are not as critically rated as the earlier episodes. A lot of people claim that the later seasons of Game of Thrones were much worse. And a lot of people suspect that it's because the showrunners at that point were starting to get the pull of Lucasfilm to go work on a Star Wars trilogy, and they were like, you know what, we've made our mark on television, we're ready to go on to the next thing, and they kind of rushed the last few seasons of production. Also because they were working with material that hadn't actually been written yet, because the books only go so far. George R. R. Martin, get off your fucking ass and finish A Song of Ice and Fire. Um, I digress. The early seasons of Game of Thrones, the ones that captivated the hearts and minds of an international audience around the world, were produced for a fraction of the budget compared to what Rings of Power has. $6 million per episode, which even by then standards was still a low budget, all things considered, because you had shows at that time that were in excess of 10 million and they were shooting it for under that. So Game of Thrones was done very much sort of on an extremely tight, we're going to make the show look as good as it can, and we're going to tighten down that dialogue and tighten down everything, make sure that script writing and everything else is as good as it possibly can be because we don't have a lot of money to work with and we need to get it, we need to get the most bang for our buck. I feel like there's a difference between that and Rings of Power where they have so much money that they've just thrown it around. I mean, I think it was this Hollywood Reporter piece. I'm gonna do a quick search. Oh, it's not gonna be this one. It might be something else. Yeah, there's another article somewhere, and I don't remember where it is, but there's something in here that talks about how um, they worked with over 1,500 visual effects artists on Rings of Power, and they brag about that as though that is some sort of number that should be taken into consideration for why the show is going to be so epic. And it's like, well, first and foremost, your script writing sucks. Like the Rings of Power has been universally panned by fans. It's not like I don't know a single Tolkien fan, and some of this might be confirmation bias because of the things I watch online. There's actually here. This is a funny thing. Well, before I sidetrack, everyone I know that's a Tolkien fan does not like Rings of Power. The only people I know who like Rings of Power haven't actually read the Silmarillion. And I was going to bring this up because there's a guy on TikTok. I can't remember who he is now. He's the one who did the T-shirts that have the different colored ears. Um, and he's big on TikTok, and he loves Rings of Power, right? I literally saw him like a week ago on TikTok reading the Silmarillion for the first time. So he's been making all of these claims over the past months about how amazing Rings of Power is and how he loves it so much. He's the exact audience that Amazon was looking for because he's never read the fucking books. He's never actually read the Silmarillion, so he didn't know all this stuff about the Second Age. So he didn't have the outrage that most of us had when we looked at the script writing and the storytelling and we went, oh my God, this idea that you're writing the novel that Tolkien never wrote to, while throwing heaps of money at it. I almost feel like they want to treat us like it's like they want us to act like we're strippers or something and just throw a bunch of money at us and tell us to shut up and sit down and enjoy the cash flow because it's like, look at how much money we're spending on this amazing production of Rings of Power. There's no way you wouldn't be able to like it because it's they literally said in those original press releases from Vanity Fair and everything else. We're creating a spectacle worthy of Marvel essentially, and creating this spectacle that the world had never seen, and doing justice to you know, the Tolkien universe, and it's like it doesn't need that. What it needs is tight, cohesive storytelling, and you don't need 56 freaking $1 million per episode to do that. You can do it for much less. So even though you get articles like this over at Winter's Coming talking about how Wheel of Time could have been better if it had a bigger budget, I actually did a video about this and said I don't actually think that's the case because Rafe Judkins has proven that he's not really he's like the Rings of Power showrunners in that he doesn't really care about the source material that much, and he's willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of coming up with his adaptation of things. But I think that in terms of creating good television, $10 million is a good number to shoot for. I don't think you can really produce anything of quality these days for less than 10 million. Remember that when Games of Thrones was shot, that was a decade ago at this point, maybe more than that. So the $6 million of then is the $10 million of today. So shooting things on $10 million per episode is doing it as tightly as I think you can in today's era. But when you just completely fail at your script writing and you also fail at having good acting and you fail at I think one of the biggest things as an example is when you look at Game of Thrones, those early seasons, everything looked lived in. It was muddy, it was gritty, it was nasty, it was gross. It was, it felt like you could smell the pig shit and the horse shit and the mud and the blood and everything else. It felt like you were there. It was very visceral. And Rings of Power and Wheel of Time, by comparison, have looked pristinely clean. No one's ever dirty. Everyone looks, perfect physiques and always perfect makeup and there's no realism to it, and that's something that takes me out because I as a viewer want to know that I'm in a world that's lived in and breathed in, and I don't get that feeling. So just because you have an unlimited budget doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to produce um, etc. This article over here at Variety says that they actually the Rings of Power cost approximately 465 million across its season, and they say that they've confirmed that. So if you use that number, I used 450 for my numbers. So if you use their numbers, let's just do a real quick 465 divided by 8. That's $58 million per episode. So if this is true, which it says that they did, um, it says they assume that the cost for this series will presumably be spread out over multiple seasons. I would not say that that's necessarily the case because a lot of the sets and places they originally filmed at in New Zealand were thrown away in favor of moving production back to the UK for tax breaks. So I don't know if that's actually the case or not. I would assume it's going to cost less per subsequent seasons if you've rebuilt all your sets and everything else. But I guess that remains to be seen. Um, Meanwhile, you've got Rings of Power coming in, and they're under $20 million per episode. Um, I think House of the Dragon looks infinitely better than Rings of Power and infinitely better than. It definitely looks better than Wheel of Time, and it has double the budget. That's cool. But it definitely shows that HBO is not afraid to spend money to get something looking good. I will say that the VFX shots, some of the VFX shots in Rings of Power do look like Marvel quality, like film quality, and some of the shots in House of the Dragon might look a little less, but I think they work great for prestige television. They don't look bad at all, but I think someone said the other day it looks more like blended compared to the VFX for Rings of Power, which are like crisp and clean and look completely high definition. And that's sort of not what they've always gone for with Game of Thrones. So big budgets don't necessarily mean anything, everybody. The most important thing at the end of the day is good storytelling, because that is what's going to get you a prestige show that wins awards and captures an international audience that universally loves your show as opposed to reviles it and hates it and thinks it's a horrible debacle. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, comments below. As always, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Support in all the ways I talked about earlier. It's super simple. On premieres like this, where I'm chatting with you, do a super chat or a sticker after the fact. You can do a one-off super thanks, or if you'd prefer, The best option is the monthly memberships, which are down there. There's 3 different tiers. We do lots of cool stuff for our members. And hopefully we'll see you on a live stream as well. Don't forget the Patreon page for the World of the Weave and the Void, which is where my wife, my brother, and I work on our 5th edition tabletop campaign setting. That's been out since May. Point and click adventure game, which is coming out this winter. And the book series, which is ongoing, serialized over at the Patreon page. Till next time, happy viewing, happy reading. Stay safe, everybody. See you in the next rant video. Peace.